Welcome everyone for another pizza seminar. Our week has been relatively full with different conferences and workshops. And now we finish it with another highlight. A pizza seminar with Vincenzo Bove, who I will introduce in a second. You do things already properly. You seem to be all experienced visitors of the pizza seminar. Have your pizza, eat it now, so you are ready for the Q&A part once Vincenzo is done with his presentation. For those of you who participate online, you have to bake your own pizza or whatever you like for lunch. Sorry, so better come next time and join us here at Friedrichstraße in Berlin Mitte. So, as you probably know, as people who come here more frequently, BIC's USP, or the things that we try to focus on, is in the wide world of security research, is how to make security measurable. Because as one of the core beliefs in management science is, you can manage what you can't measure. And therefore, when our colleague Adelaide Kelly introduced me to the idea and to the work of Vincenzo Bove, I was immediately convinced. It didn't take you much to convince me that we want to hear more about your work and what it is that you are doing. Because clearly the topic you will be talking about is something that is eminent in many parts of this world, especially in our, let's say, our part of the world, the Western part, where thanks to our high standard of living, disruptions, for example, caused by terrorism, cause a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty among people. That has, of course, an effect on the quality of life, but also has an economic impact. So it's something that we see all the time, that people then, as a consequence of a relatively, if you look at it from let's say, in a rational kind of rational manner, a relatively low impact terrorist attack then has a second round of effects that are much more severe. So, as you hopefully hear, we are super interested in your work, to learn more about it, what kind of methods you use and what outcome you come up with. Vincenzo Bove is a professor at IMT, stands for the School of Advanced Study in Lucca. Before we came online and before some of you arrived, we already talked a little bit about the institution. You are an economist by training. Again, something that makes you particularly interesting for us, an economist working in the field of security. You've been in Britain at the University of Warwick before, and today your path leads you to Berlin. So thank you for the effort and for coming here. I'm looking forward to your presentation and then later to discuss your work with you. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
I give it back to you and eat my pizza.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to present what is a summary of our recent research on the effect of terrorism on public attitudes and well-being in Great Britain. This is a series of papers with my co-authors, George Joseph Tivulu from the University of Sheffield and Harry Pickard from Newcastle University. I started this project when I was in the UK, when I was a professor of political science at the University of Warwick for many years. And let me give you a little bit of background information about okay. Oh yeah. So a little bit of background information. So this is not, I would say, there's not standard academic research, because the project was funded by 2 grants from the government, from the European Social Research Council. So we applied to them. And the main aim of the projects was to generate impact. Now, impact is very important for universities in the UK, because every 6-7 years, universities in the UK, they go through the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework. It's a way to evaluate all universities in the UK. And one main component of REF is impact. To what extent academics are generating impact. And the way impact is defined is kind of very strict. You need to show that your research was capable of changing behavior among your target audience. So if your audience are policymakers, you need to show evidence, right? It's not just narrative, showing evidence that policymakers changed some of their behavior, some actions in response to your research. Obviously, it's very difficult, right? So in most cases, people get a very low score in terms of impact, right? Because how do you, I mean, as an economist, how do you do that, right? You need to be lucky enough to publish something that is picked by policymakers. They need to read it, understand it, and then they should take actions in response to it and say, oh, look at what you found, hence we're going to do that, and you need to provide evidence. Very, very difficult. So what we did, we flipped what is the usual impact production. We first picked a non-academic partner, like a target audience, okay? Because we wanted to work on terrorism, our partner obviously was the Home Office, in particular the Homeland Security Group, in particular people working on counterterrorism, okay? And what we did, we went there basically and said, we had meetings there and said, shall we apply to an ESRC together, to a grant together as partners, so academia and policymaking community, but you need to tell us what you would like us to address. So these are the data available that we do know how to analyze. These are the potential techniques. These are some ideas we have in mind. What do you want to know? Okay. And they really, given that they were working on, they are still working on managing the consequences of terrorism. So they mostly work, just to give a little bit of a background, they work on preventing terrorism in the UK, which is very difficult. And of course, once terrorism happens, mitigating the consequences of terrorism. So how do we reduce as much as possible the cost of terrorism, given that some terrorist attacks will happen in any case, okay? So we know that will happen in the future. We need to mitigate the cost of it. And the objective, the target is not academic publication as such, even though we published many articles, but the main final objective was to contribute to the next UK strategy for countering terrorism, which is called the Contest. It's a very important piece of document where the UK prepares for the next wave of attacks and how to deal with them, okay? And the output is 6 academic articles, but many technical reports that were only for the Home Office, okay? Where we did, where we summarized our research, we focused on some specific research questions. So, what is the effect of terrorism? So, just to give you a little bit of overview of the literature. So, and what we did, you think about terrorist attacks, and if you focus on the UK, you do have a variety of terrorist attacks. You have Islamic terrorist attacks, you have far-right attacks. In the UK, we used to have the IRA terrorist attacks. So there is a variety of potential perpetrators with different goals. You have a variety of victims that you should take into account. There is different media coverage of terrorist attacks in the UK. Some terrorist attacks are much more covered than others. And then, you know, we consider a number of characteristics. It's not just we unpack it. We open the black box. We also look at the distance between each terrorist attack and individuals to see how exposed are individuals, because of course some individuals are far away from the terrorist attack, some are closer. So the main, from the literature in psychology, economics, and political science, we know that terrorism will trigger some emotional responses. So our first study was to look at the emotional reaction to terrorist attacks in terms of fear, anger, sadness, anxiety, but also duration of the emotional response. Then we looked at the attitudes towards institutions and society, what kind of sentiments terrorist attacks will shape, how trust in institutions will change in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, our civil liberty will change, preferences for a stronger state, for example, at the expense of personal liberties. Migration preferences is also very important, national identity, like a battery of attitudes that we believe, that the Home Office believes the terrorism will probably trigger, okay? We also looked at the well-being effect of terrorism, and I will focus more on well-being later. So it will be the core of my presentation. Like the last paper we produced was on the effect of terrorism on life satisfaction and mental distress as a measure, as a way to understand the cost of terrorism beyond the obvious economic cost, right? So most of the economic studies on terrorism, they look at destruction of infrastructures, how many people died, interruption of communications, traveling, and so on. We focus on well-being because it's also part of the economic cost. And now, and so we covered pretty much this area here. And now we're preparing a third project with the Home Office again, where we will focus on behavioral outcomes. There is quite a lot of literature by now on how terrorism affects attitudes, but we don't know how attitudes translate in actual behavior. So say that people become more negative towards migration, okay? Or people become more anxious, or people trust less other people, for example, members of minority. How these changes will actually translate in the actual changes in behavior. Are people becoming more mobile, less mobile, more productive? What are the changes in access to mental health services? Are people more likely to attend outdoor gatherings or events? So, for example, we know from anecdotal evidence that in the aftermath of the Manchester Arena bombing, obviously there was a huge drop in the number of people going out, particularly in the region, right? And you might say, well, it's obvious, right? But we want to look at that in a systematic way with all possible data available on mobility in the UK to see to what extent people stop going out, and also duration of the effect, which is not obvious. Do people go back to the previous habits after a while, or the change is a permanent change? Okay. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence here, but there is very, very little kind of rigorous scientific and large N evidence. So that's pretty much the overview of what we did. So now I will summarize some of the studies we published before I focus on the well-being paper. So one of the first papers we published is the emotional effect of terrorism. Okay, so here it's the first kind of first level of impact of terrorism. We know there is an impact on emotions, but how do you measure it? So one way to do that is to do a sentiment analysis of tweets. Okay, so what we basically did, we downloaded millions of online posts from Twitter between 2016 and 2020, and they coincide with 8 major terrorist attacks. So for each terrorist attack, we look at changes in emotions. All the emotions are emotions attached to terrorism. So we look at the wording of the tweets, right? So what people are talking about. We only identify and subsample only the tweets talking about terrorism, talking about the terrorist attack. So we want to make sure that people are reacting to the terrorist attack only. They are not changing emotions for some other causes. And then we look at the kind of wording and kind of emotion attached to the tweets about terrorism. And as you can imagine, fear, negative emotions, they go up. Fear, anger, to some extent sadness also goes up. You can see the before and after, right? This is the hours before and hours after the terrorist attack. Disgust as well, even though so the effects are quite sharp, but they're very short-lived. After a few hours, people forget about it. People talk about something else, okay? Which doesn't mean that the emotional state does not remain affected, but they change topic after a while. They start talking about something else. We also did the same study, the same analysis for all the topics that are usually associated to terrorism. In particular in the UK, every time there is a terrorist attack, people talk about migration. Okay, so migration is a big issue. So we do the same sort of study, and we find pretty much same patterns. People are more negative about immigration in the aftermath, in the few hours after a terrorist attack. Then we want to talk. Then we started studying the sort of more of the political impact of terrorism. Particularly, the Home Office was really they really want to know about polarization, because polarization in the UK is a big issue now. So polarization is defined as the way people are positive about their own party and negative towards the opposite party. Okay, and you look at the distance between these two sentiments and opinion, because polarization is going up in the UK, and it's an issue. So we wanted to understand what is the impact of terrorism on polarization. Okay, and what we did was we didn't expect these results. So we started by a simple analysis of polarization in the aftermath of 4 terrorist attacks, and by chance, we basically, so what we did, we took the British election study, which is one of the biggest data sets in the UK on public opinion, polarization, and so on. And then some of the waves of the British election study, they coincided with some terrorist attacks. So during the field work of the survey, some terrorist attacks happened, and we were capable of measuring polarization at the few hours before versus the few hours after. And the difference is the causal impact of terrorism. Okay? The technique is called unexpected event during survey design. To the extent that the timing is unexpected, no one was expecting it, of course, you can actually gauge and measure the causal impact of terrorism. So what we found that in the aggregate, we didn't find much, but when you disaggregate the terrorist attack and you look at far-right attacks versus Islamic terrorist attacks, you get the opposite results. So far-right attacks, by chance, this is not like a self-selection. By chance, 2 waves coincided with Jo Cox's murder. She was a member of the parliament. She was stabbed, I believe, in 2016 by a far-right activist, and the Finsbury Park attack, where a mosque with a number of Muslims was attacked, and a few died. And then we look at the 2 Islamic attacks. Again, the selection is a random selection because they happen to coincide with the 2 waves. The Manchester Arena bombing and the London Bridge stabbing. So this one was quite big. As you can see, far-right attacks are depolarizing the electorate, whereas Islamic attacks are polarizing it. So people become more polarized, and then we look at what's happened, why people are more polarized and less polarized. Now, what happens here? People are become more polarized and then become more negative about migration. There is much more discussion about the pros and cons of open borders. There is much more discussion here about whether civil liberties should be restricted to prevent future terrorist attacks. And in these cases, there are two kind of big groups, one pro and one against it. So what is happening is Islamic terrorist attacks are making some topics much more salient. And every time these topics become more salient, there is debate around them, and the electorate and the citizens, they polarize. Whereas for far-right attacks, usually people get together. There is a sense of unity in the aftermath of it. First, politicians usually invite people to unite against the far-right terrorists. And people, as a consequence of this, people try to be more moderate in the way they express their opinion. They usually, not all of them, they condemn the attack. Also, far-right politicians, they're very quick in condemning the attack and say, no. The idea was good, but the violence is no good. So they say, we kind of, I know what you did, why you did that, but violence is not acceptable. It's not acceptable. So this, in a way, kind of depolarized, decreased polarization. So it was really interesting to see, to unpack terrorist incidents, because they are not all the same, right? And they do have, and it's very interesting to see how they have the same magnitude here. Now, so that was the, I mean, feel free to ask me any question if you want, or to interrupt me. So again, because far-right attacks are increasing in the UK, the other question was, can we do more about, can we understand a little bit more what happens after far-right attacks only? So we studied all the far-right terrorist attacks that coincided with waves of opinion survey. So this is similar to a natural experiment where you do, again, randomly, you do have far-right terrorist attacks during the field work of a survey, and then you compare people before and after. In particular, we look at political orientation. So to what extent you're on the right or on the left, on a scale between 0 and 10, where 0 you're far left and 10 you're far right. Okay. What we find here is that in the aftermath of a right attack, people move away from far right positions. Okay. They move towards the center. They become more moderate. Okay, people get together. Again, the sense of unity, and people distance themselves from the ideology, which is associated with the perpetrator. In fact, we also find that in the aftermath of far-right attack, people become more positive about immigration, more positive about open borders, more positive about all the ideas that are usually associated to a far-right ideology. That's a way to reject it. Now, one big question is, obviously, are people genuine in the land? Because these are opinion survey, right? So we're asking people, what do you think about immigration? And the aftermath, they say, oh, immigration is excellent. We should have as many immigrants as possible. Now, this obviously is partially driven by what is called desirability bias. So people give an answer that they believe is desirable. Okay, it's not contentious. Okay, because they know that far-right attacks are no good, right? And so which doesn't mean that they're really genuine, but that's what we find. We find that actually, if anything, the people are less skeptical about immigration. They are less likely to report nationalistic attitudes. Okay, so which should be like the purpose of a far-right attack anyway. We also look at how terrorist attacks affects identification and national identity. Now, the UK is a really great case because it's a mess in terms of national identity. People usually identify very strongly with regional identities. If you go to Scotland, they identify mostly with a Scottish identity, and to a lesser extent with a British identity. Okay. The same goes for English. So in England, people identify very strongly with an English identity. They also identify with a British identity, of course. So you do have regional identities and national identities. Okay, and we want to look at what happens when, again, people are exposed to a terrorist attack. We also look at the distance to the terrorist attack in terms of geographical distance and time proximity. But anyway, what we find here that if people they develop a stronger British national identity, so they move away from regional identity. They are less likely to identify with the regional identity, more likely to identify with the national identity. They're even more positive towards the EU for some reasons. So, which is kind of linked to the idea of a unity effect. So, kind of terrorism unites against a common enemy, and people get together. And they are more likely to identify with supranational identity. Okay. Finally, we try to understand whether the effect of terrorism is short-lived. Okay, that's a very tough question. You can't usually do that with existing data because imagine you do have like any dependent variable. Say that you want to look at political opinion or attitude towards immigration. You have a terrorist attack, you look at how people change their opinion in the aftermath, but the longer you move, the more you move away from the terrorist attack, the more difficult it is to say that that opinion is driven by a terrorist attack, because there are so many things going on in the middle, right? People might change opinion about migration because so many other factors. So what we did, we took the only variable available in a large survey where there was people were consistently asked the same question pretty much every day, which is what do you believe is the risk of terrorism today? So the question was about terrorism, was not about something which might be unrelated in a way. As you can see, and then we look at all terrorist attacks in the UK, and this is the average impact on the risk of terrorism over time. As you can see, of course, it goes up quite a lot. Here it's like 50% people, and then it goes up to almost 80%, right? But then it goes down slowly over time, right? Slowly over time. And then after 120 days, it's almost back to the baseline, to the pre-attack level. Okay, so that's the average duration of the attack. However, as you can imagine, there is a lot of heterogeneity. We are pulling together all terrorist attacks in the UK, but some are minor attacks with only 1 victim, 2 victims, so they're not very well known. If you take the most, the large-scale attack, the most well-known attack, the most traumatizing attack, like the London bombing in 2005, okay, you do find almost a level shift. So risk of terrorism goes up and stays up for many, many months. It doesn't go back to the baseline, to the pre-attack level. So it's similar to like a level shift in the perception of risk of terrorism. Yeah.
Risk of terrorism, what's the exact question? That I am affected by an act of terrorism, or that I think that there will be some terrorist attack?
Whether you think there will be a terrorist attack, yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Whether you believe there will be soon a terrorist attack, and so you can say it's zero. Yeah, exactly. Yes, in all Britain. Yeah. It's a very general question about whether you feel, and then of course, in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, 80% of people say, "Oh, there will be soon another terrorist attack," because they've just been exposed to a terrorist attack. So that's so small scale attack, of course, fade within about a month, but the large scale attack, they can actually be long lasting. Okay, so now focusing on one specific study, one thing that we wanted to know is the cost of it's linked to the economic cost of terrorism in a way. We know quite a lot about the economic cost of terrorism in terms of trade, in terms of business closures and so on, but we know much less about the more of an observable cost of terrorism in terms of life satisfaction and mental health. So we do, as I said, we do have quite a lot of evidence about the impact of terrorism on economic activities. Usually the studies are at the country level. You have multiple countries. But the effect of terrorism on public mental health is much less known. In the UK, well-being is becoming particularly important because the Treasury is finding a way to come up with a better indicator of quality of life beyond the GDP per capita or income. So how do we come up with, and well-being is becoming like one of the indicator of quality of life. So self-reported well-being, of course. So that's why the Home Office was really into understanding the cost of terrorism in terms of well-being. Now, we do know that terrorism is triggering a state of negative emotions. We also find evidence about that, but also some authors of mine in other papers, they do find very similar results. Now, there are papers, economic papers, published in very good journals on the the impact of terrorism on well-being. Now, there are many papers after 9/11 in the US, of course, and you find huge impact on well-being, as you can imagine. There are quite a number of at least 5 papers in the UK looking at the impact of the 2005 London bombing attack on well-being in the UK. But we're talking about emblematic attacks, very large-scale attack, right? And of course, there is evidence that the impact was very large, as you can imagine. But the Home Office and our conversation was like, what can we get? Can we get the effect of the average terrorist attack? Because these terrorist attacks, London bomb in 2005, or the 2016 Berlin market, they are very rare, right? How often do you find a terrorist attack killing dozen people, right? It's very, very rare. In most cases, every year, you have very small scale attack, right? Where a few people die, unfortunately, but they're not huge terrorist attacks. Okay. So the question was like, we know that we'll be targeted by more minor terrorist attacks in the future. We want to know what is the impact of these attacks, right? Because otherwise, of course, if you report evidence about a large impact on well-being by only focusing on a large-scale attack, it's quite obvious, right, that you do find this sort of results. Okay, so we consider what is the typical attack by analyzing. We look at the universe of casualty causing terrorist attacks in the UK since 91, which, as I said, is crucial from a policy point of view. We built a unique individual wave attack level data set. I will give you more details about the data in a second. And then we employ a comprehensive measure of well-being that is usually employed in medicine as well, in psychology, which is a combination of life satisfaction and mental distress. Okay, so what do? We look at, we're using a panel data. So we have the same people interviewed for multiple waves, for many waves. So it's one of the largest panel survey available in the world, actually, not only Europe, it's huge. And it's consistently run since 91, so it's really big. We do have two questions. Okay, one question is life satisfaction. The answer to the question, how dissatisfied or satisfied are you with your life overall? And you can give an answer between 1 and 7, very straightforward. The second one is a little bit more complex. That's mental distress. This is shaped by clinical medicine. That's a way to measure the mental health of people. So people need to answer the following questions. How you have been feeling over the last few weeks. And you need to answer this question for a number of items, for a number of categories. For example, the emotional well-being, whether you feel happy, you feel depressed, quite obvious. Then the stress and anxiety. Are you sleeping well? How long are you sleeping? Whether you are self-confident. Do you feel worthless? Cognitive functioning. Can you concentrate? Can you focus? Can you work properly? Social engagement is also very important. Do you go out? Do you see people? Are you enjoying daily activities? Do you feel a sense of purpose in your life? Okay, and then you combine the answers for all these questions. These are 36 questions in the end. And you combine the answers and you come up with a composite index. You can also look at disaggregated answers if you want, if you believe that one component is more important than others. Otherwise, use a composite index of mental distress. Now, terrorist attack. Now, in economics, we mostly use this data set, this definition, but in political science, there is a huge debate about what is terrorism. What we use is the global terrorism database, which is very well known and it's very comprehensive. So what is the definition? It's the premeditated use or threat to use violence by individuals or subnational groups. Okay, the target needs to be non-combatants, so it's against non-combatants. Terrorist attack or attack against military personnel is not terrorism. Okay, the target needs to be civilians. They want to obtain a political or social objective, so you need to have a clear objective, and you want to intimidate an audience which goes well beyond the victims. So it's not obviously limited to the victims. What happens then? You're not, unorganized forms of violence are not included. So riots, mob violence is dropped. Non-political acts of violence are not included. Violent crimes, school shootings, not included. Now, and that's there's a controversy here. Violent repression by the government is not included. What is called state terrorism. Now, it's not an issue in the UK. Well, not now. In the 70s, probably it was a problem. Not now, but of course, there's a lot of debate because in many countries you do have state terrorism. So anyway, so you need to come up. You need to stick to a definition at some point. If you stick to this definition, you get 97 terrorist attacks with at least one casualties, okay? Because we want to look at the terrorist attacks that people know about. Otherwise, you get like I don't know how many thousands. You get, of course, small scale foiled terrorist attacks, stabbing without deaths, and so on and so forth. It becomes not manageable, okay? Now, this is special. And we're not looking at Northern Ireland, because otherwise it would be like I don't know many. There's no Northern Ireland here, of course. So it's only Great Britain. No, yeah, we dropped Northern. No, we don't have Northern Ireland, but we do have quite a nice spatial distribution of terrorism. Of course, London is a hotspot, right? Needless to say, right? But it's quite well spread, however. Also in rural areas, in less urban areas, there are some terrorist attacks in Scotland as well. Not many, but of course you do have terrorists. So you do have quite a few terrorist attacks here, 97 in total. So the data set construction. So it's a panel data. Okay, so people are interviewed for many years every year. Okay. So imagine you are individual 1, and this is wave 1, okay? Now you are interviewed, you are being asked questions about your well-being and life satisfaction, and then a terrorist attack happens, and then a second one happens, and a third one happens, and then they interview you again, and they ask you the same questions, okay? What we look at is of course, the difference in your answer after each attack. So we do consider we look at the average effect of one terrorist attack. So imagine in the data set, each row is a terrorist attack. So we look at the effect of each individual attack on the way you change your well-being and life satisfaction. Now you have 3 attacks here. You are interviewed again. Good. So the timing is completely random, right? The timing of the interview and the timing of the terrorist attacks are completely random. So that which allows you to make causal claims about the impact of terrorism on well-being. Now, imagine there is an individual number 2 now, is being interviewed at the same time as individual number 1 in wave 1, but then there is terrorist attack 1 and terrorist attack 2 as individual number 1, but the guy is being interviewed before terrorist attack 3 happens, okay? So he doesn't know anything about terrorist attack number 3, and we look at the impact for this individual, we look at the impact only of terrorist attack number 1 and 2. Not number 3, because he doesn't know about terrorist attack number 3. That's pretty much the idea, okay? Okay, so when we do that, we come up with for life satisfaction. We do have it's a panel data, right? So we do have quite a number of individuals, 53,500 individuals, and more than 1 million observations. With mental distress, we do have 56,000 individuals over 24 waves, 24 years, and 1,300,000 observations. We do now, to avoid measurement error, we drop individuals who are interviewed the same day of the terrorist attack, because we don't know, we don't have the hour of the interview. So we don't know whether they know or they don't know about terrorist attack. So we drop them in these cases. Now we also, although it's just a matter of taste, we also drop movers, people who move from one wave to the other wave. Why? Because there is a literature, particularly on African countries, showing that terrorism also increases migration, right? Internal migration. People move away from, for example, in Nigeria, from area where Boko Haram is targeting civilians, okay? Now, in the UK, it's very unlikely that terrorist attacks is pushing people to leave an area, also because it's scattered all around the UK. And the location very often is random. You might believe that being in London makes you more vulnerable, which is true, but you don't know where exactly in London the terrorist attack will happen. So, but anyway, we drop individuals who are moving, just to make sure that we are not picking, there is no self-selection, okay? And people are moving away from the location of the next terrorist attack. Now, we do look at two measures of exposure. One is geographical exposure, whether people reside close to the terrorist attack. And we can do that because our data set is geolocated. So we know the location of the respondents, we know where they live, okay? And we also know the coordinates of the terrorist attack. So so they are both geolocated. We're going to look at the distance between the two, okay? So we look at distance in kilometers between the individual's residence and the location point of each terrorist attack. We also look at the temporal proximity. We look at whether, as a first cut, we look at whether the terrorist attack happened in the last 30 days or not. Of course, the effect will fade away over time. Now, the identification is quite straightforward. We look at the well-being of individual I in wave W after each attack. So what we're estimating is the impact of one average attack, of one attack. We include individual and wave times a weak fixed effect. It's very well specified. We do look at the attack fixed effect because, of course, all the attacks are different from each other. So we want to also absorb heterogeneity in the typology of attack. And beta 1 is the impact of the well-being altering effect of terrorism. Okay, so this is just a slide about particularly some economists obsessed about endogeneity and whether you can make causal claims. As I told you before, it's a panel data, okay? So we have the same people interviewed over time. We are dropping everyone who is moving. So we are absorbing any source of heterogeneity across individuals to make sure that people exposed are similar to people unexposed, except for the occurrence of a terrorist attack. So pretty much the same characteristics. But we also do some additional specification to basically assuage any concern, any remaining concern about the identification of our impact of terrorism. Okay, life satisfaction. Now, life satisfaction, this is the estimate. We look at the exposure to terrorist attacks. Now, the coefficients are not easy to interpret because the exposure is the inverse of the distance in kilometers. So it's not easy to interpret. But what do? We benchmark. We find that exposure to terrorist attacks decreases life satisfaction across a bunch of specifications where we include or exclude fixed effect when we do a number of modification of the models. However, given that the coefficients are not easy to interpret, we benchmark our results against major individual events, okay? Because in our data set, we do have so many information about people's lives, okay? We know whether you lost your job, we know whether you lost your wife, we know whether something bad happened to you, okay? So we can look at the impact of those circumstances on your life satisfaction and benchmark it against terrorist attacks to see how big is the impact of terrorist attack compared to something else, which is also bad, which is also affecting in a negative way your life satisfaction. And what we find is our coefficient, if you compare the most exposed to the least exposed individuals, the effect is 10% of the effect of losing a job, okay? Which is, we're talking about the average impact of one attack, which is, so in a way, in terms of size, it's not negligible. 7% of becoming long-term disabled and 10% of becoming widow, okay? That's just to give you an order of magnitude of how important is a terrorist attack on life satisfaction. Now, one thing which is important to bear in mind, however, people forget about it after a while. Okay, as I told you before, you find an impact, but whether it's long lasting or not is a big question. So what we do here, we look at whether the attack happened more than 30 days ago versus whether the attack happened in the last month. And we find that the effect is only significant and much larger for attacks in the last month. More than 1 month, we don't find any significant effect. Okay, so the effect is big, it's quite large, it's very large, particularly with attacks, but it's only for temporarily close attacks. Okay, so endogeneity concern, I think I will skip it. So what we do here in a nutshell, again, just to make sure that people who live in region exposed to terrorist attacks, they don't have any sort of pre-trend, any sort of dynamics in terms of life satisfaction that are different from people living in non-exposed areas. We do what we call falsification test. Okay, so we run the same model, but we change the dependent variable. We change the dependent variable in 2 ways. We use as a dependent variable something which is completely unrelated to terrorism. So like a factor which should not be affected by terrorism. And the other thing we do, we use as a dependent variable lagged value of life satisfaction. So we look at how terrorist attacks today affects your life satisfaction yesterday, which should not be. You should not find anything. If you find something, that's a red flag. That means that there might be some parallel trends and some sort of heterogeneity in your sample. It's a falsification test. So in terms of question which is unrelated to terrorism, we for example take financial well-being, which is the answer to the question, how well would you say you yourself are managing financially this day? So financial well-being should not be affected. And the same goes for a previous level of life satisfaction. So we find that exposure doesn't affect these two variables. We also try more variables, of course, but just to mitigate any remaining concern about endogeneity. Okay, so mental distress. Now mental distress. So we do run the same model, but now the dependent variable is mental well-being. Is the composite index I showed you before. It's pretty much insignificant. So when we show the first time the results to the Home Office, we're like, what? I mean, how can we? So we know that usually, particularly from anecdotal evidence, we know that people suffer from terrorist attacks in terms of mental well-being, and you should pick at least some effect. We don't find anything. Then we focus on attack. We do the same that we did with the previous variable. We look at attack that happened more than 1 month ago versus attacks in the last month, and still we don't find anything. So there is no difference here. People don't seem to be exposed. But then we spoke to some psychologists who work in the Home Office, and they work on the effect of major trauma and so on terrorist attacks. And they say, from our own experience, anecdotal evidence, we kind of expect it, because what we usually find, it's only people who are already troubled, who already have problems with mental health, they are affected by terrorist attacks. That's what we know from our own experience. So what do we do then? We try this argument, and we only look at people who have initial mental health conditions before the terrorist attack. So the first time they are interviewed in the data set, in the wave, we look at their sort of initial condition of mental health. And then we look at people who have an initial value of mental distress above 8, above 10, and above 12. So we look at the tercile of the distribution. And what we find is that only people with initial high level of mental distress are those displaying an effect of terrorism. It's only people who are already distressed. For some reasons, of course, that we don't know why, but we only know that they already have some conditions, and they do that. And so the terrorist attacks adds to their mental distress. So we also decompose the effect here. We look at, remember, there are components here, and we look at whether so what happens with social dysfunctions, and of course, people are less likely to go out, to gather outside, to meet people in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. Now, again, we differentiate between people with low mental distress at the start date of the interview, and people with high initial conditions. And you see that with people with no problems, they don't show any sort of effect of terrorism, whereas people with initial conditions, they do. We also look at anxiety and depression, and again, we find pretty much same results, and confidence loss. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, okay, and again, we do falsification test here, but I can skip also the robustness checks. So now the final thing we did with our non-academic partner was looking at the economic cost of terrorism. So given our estimate, how do you translate it into an economic cost? Okay. And the reason why you want to do that, of course, is if you think about it, if you are a policymaker, right, and you're fighting terrorism or you're fighting crime, and you need resources to do that, right? What you need to do, what they usually do, is a kind of cost and benefit analysis, right? So if you give me more resources, I can prevent an additional attack, because one attack, that's the cost of an attack. That's the economic cost of an attack. So in a way, you need to have this sort of idea about the cost of a potential terrorist attack and what is the value of preventing it, right? Now, the difficulty here is not straightforward to translate mental health into economic cost. So one way, but it's just one way, is to look at previous studies on the relation between income and life satisfaction. In this case, in the UK, it's a well-known study 15 years ago about how an increase in income increases life satisfaction. Okay, you take this paper, you take the estimate, and they show that the annual gross household income increases life satisfaction by 30% of a standard deviation. In our case, in our data set, 30% of a standard deviation is 0.58 units. Okay, and then you save this information. Then you look at the median annual gross income in the UK, which was at the end of our analysis was almost £26,000, which translates into a monthly income of £2,000. Okay, if you divide by 12, okay, over a month period. Okay. Then we look at our estimate. We look at our most conservative estimate, where we look at the lower bound of the effect of terrorism on life satisfaction. Okay, so we know the relation between income and life satisfaction. We know the relation between terrorism and life satisfaction. So we line up all the dots, and we can look at, and then we can calculate how terrorism translates into a number, into a value. In our case, we can show that the kind of cost of a terrorist attack is £78 per individual. Now, this is usually referred as the willingness to pay. So how much are you willing to pay to avoid a terrorist attack? £78. Now, what do we do then? Because we want to have an idea about the national cost of a terrorist attack across the country, we look at the aggregate willingness to pay for all major areas in London, in the UK. So what we do basically, take all the area in London. Okay, you have the population, right, for each area. Then when you want to look at your willingness to pay to avoid a terrorist attack, you should take into consideration two information. The first one is the relation between the terrorist attack and income and money, but also the probability of being exposed to a terrorist attack, right? So you might say that you want to avoid it, but if you live in an area where there are no terrorist attacks, there is very low risk of terrorist attacks. Probably your willingness to pay will be much lower, because you know that it's very unlikely that you will be exposed to terrorist attacks. So what we do, as a kind of a very rough proxy for the probability of being exposed to terrorist attack, we look at the average number of attacks per year. Okay, now London, inner London, of course, has 1.7 deadly attacks per year. But there are other areas in the UK where there is almost nothing, right? Well, usually you do have attacks, of course, but if you think about Plymouth, Plymouth 0.04. I mean, they don't really have any sort of any kind of experience of terrorism. So what do we do here? We adjust our willingness to pay with the probability of experiencing a terrorist attack every year. So what is the probability of it? So we adjust it, and then we aggregate, looking at the population for each area, and in the end we get an aggregate willingness to pay, which is adjusted by the risk of exposure, and you get all kinds of estimates. So for inner London, it's going to be, for each terrorist attack, £385 million per terrorist attack, much lower in areas where there is where terrorist attacks are very rare, and then you basically sum up all these values. Okay, conclusion. So what do we find? We find that being geographically close to terrorist attacks leads to lower levels of life satisfaction. But we find also, which is, I think is interesting in and of itself, that we find an inequality in the response to terrorism. So people with initial level of mental distress are those showing an impact of terrorist attack, like a negative or poor mental health conditions in the aftermath. What we're gonna do now? What is so the obvious implication? We're very happy that we can show that we are contributing to the counter-terrorism strategy of the UK. So our universities will be full of glory and whatever. My former university, actually, not my actual university, will be full of glory and so on. But because that's the way that's in a way one of the best way you can actually show impact. Even though, as I told you, we flipped the way you do impact in a way. We kind of circumvented it by approaching the policymakers before, not after. I think that's yeah. I mean that's effective way of producing impact. What we're going to do now with the Home Office, again, we are looking at the behavioral impact of terrorism. Now, so we are putting together data on mobility patterns. People, for example, just to give you an example, what we're doing right now, looking at terrorist attacks in London. We look at how often people use the tube, the London tube, the days after terrorist attack. And of course, you find that people don't take the tube, or are less likely to take the tube. But we also look at what they do then. Do they stay home? Do they take a car? Do they take a bus? They cycle? What kind of behavioral responses? We are looking at the community interactions. We do have very good data for some cities in London, in the UK, where we know whether people on a daily basis they interact with minorities. Okay, so how often you go and talk to your neighbor who is from a different ethnic background, okay, to see how terrorist attacks, Islamic terrorist attacks, affect the probability of social interactions with minorities. Because obviously we know from previous studies, also from our own studies, that people are more negative towards minorities, towards Muslims. But then the question is whether this translates into actual changes in behavior, okay? Now, in terms of mental health, now one big problem with this, which doesn't apply only to us, but to everyone using data on mental well-being, these are self-reported, okay? These are self-reported, so people are responding to a question about how you feel, but of course it's not entirely reliable the way you feel, right? One more reliable way is to look at whether people go and look for mental health services. Okay, so there, and the other thing we are also putting together are data on prescriptions, medical prescriptions. Okay, because it's more of a more tangible way of measuring mental well-being. Okay, a way, because obviously there's not a very good correlation between what you self-reported measures and what you're actually doing as a result of it. All right, thank you for your attention.